Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special one-on-one edition of Newsmakers TV. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Monday, February 26, 2024. And today I'm speaking with Catherine Spillar, co-founder and executive director of Feminist Majority and Feminist Majority Foundation, as well as executive director of Ms. Magazine. She'll be giving the keynote speech at one of the foremost events on the local political calendar next week, the President's Circle Luncheon of the Santa Barbara Women's Political Committee. More on that later. But first, Kathy, welcome to Newsmakers. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be with you.
Let me first ask you, what is a feminist majority?
We're a national women's rights organization. Our goal is women's full equality. And we engage in both educational activities through the Feminist Majority Foundation, but also more political activities through our arm called the Feminist Majority. We work on college campuses and high school campuses to inspire feminist activism and learning about women's fundamental human rights. We also work with Planned Parenthood and the National Abortion Federation to counter anti-abortion extremist violence against abortion providers and clinics. And as you said, we publish Ms. Magazine. So we have a number of programs in addition to our political organizing.
Okay, well, look, I got to start by asking you about this story that's just been dominating the political news cycle for the last week, and that is this ruling by the Alabama Supreme Court involving in vitro fertilization, or IVF. And in the matter, the court ruled that frozen embryos are children. The hospital had accidentally destroyed several dozen frozen embryos of couples going through IVF. And the court said they could be held liable under the state's 1872 wrongful death of a minor statute. Why is this case so significant, and why is it attracting so much attention?
Well, it's an extraordinary decision, just extraordinary to think that now a fertilized egg is an quote unquote extrauterine child. It is placing not only IVF in jeopardy, and you saw that over the weekend, a number of the IVF clinics in Alabama have now shut down, but it is placing in jeopardy birth control and contraception. If you're defining a fertilized egg as a human being, which of course has been the objective of the anti-abortion extreme movement in this country for decades, then you are also putting in jeopardy some forms of contraception and birth control, like the IUD, which is a very popular form. Some fertilized eggs are washed out as a result of the IUD. The Catholic Church has long contended that the birth control pill is a form of an abortion. And so that's what, I mean, I think they have played their hand way over the top with this decision. And it endangers, as I said, not only IVF, but also some forms of contraception. It also, the Chief Justice's opinion essentially says it's his theology. It is the theology of Alabama that this is the way it is, that you're defining a fertilized egg as a full human being, as a child. That is a violation of the separation of church and state, which has been the grand tradition here in this country. It has crossed a line. They said the quiet part out loud. They intend that this is going to be a Christian nation, which is what we're fighting right now in so many different ways. Christian nationalism, that somehow and their particular Christian faith, I mean, there's many different faiths within Christianity, but it's their particular faith that should be the law of the land and govern. So I think it finally has, one, they said the quiet part out loud, but this is simply going to give more fuel for the country that, for those in the country that want abortion to remain safe and legal, even more reason to get out and vote in this election.
All right, a lot to unpack there, but essentially, this goes to the fundamental notion of fetal personhood, which, of course, was the basis of the Dobbs decision rolling back Roe v. Wade. President Biden said, make no mistake, this is a direct result of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Make that connection for us, if you would. Connect those dots.
Well, before the Dobbs decision, this kind of a decision could not have been handed down by a state Supreme Court because abortion could not be infringed upon in this very earliest stage, which is obviously what this does too. It means that even an early abortion at all of these heartbeat bills at 6 weeks, which is really not 6 weeks. We can go over that too, but even restricting very early abortion now is prohibited under this kind of ruling. If a fertilized egg is a human being, you can't even have early abortion. What do you do about ectopic pregnancies? What do you do about an ectopic pregnancy where the fertilized egg has implanted in the ovarian tube and is a fatal situation? It is going to end with the woman's death if it is not ended. And the most effective way of ending an ectopic pregnancy is with the abortion pill, mifepristone. So now that is no longer an option under this kind of a ruling. So it takes it to the very extreme, which is now permitted under the Dobbs decision. Remember, in the Dobbs decision, Justice Alito said he wanted to return the decision on abortion to the people. Now, mind you, Alabama's state legislature is under 15% women. So the people he returned it to was a bunch of men and mostly old men. And now it turns out turning it to a male Supreme Court justice in a male court who wants to define a fertilized egg as a full human being. It just shows you the extremism that this anti-abortion movement will go to.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Alito in that decision was sort of at pains to say, oh, this is really a very modest thing. It's a pro-democracy ruling. We're just returning this to the states. And we've seen 21 states essentially banning abortion, or at least having very, very early bans on it, among other things. What about the politics of this? Because it was very interesting to me over the weekend to see Republicans sort of trying to back away from this to get away from it. But yet it seems that this is a logical extension of the Supreme Court, the conservative supermajority that was put on there by Donald Trump, who himself was trying to say, oh, no, I'm a big fan of IVF. Talk about the politics a little bit.
Right. Well, even the leading anti-abortion Republicans in the Senate and the House and of course Donald Trump know how extreme this decision was, and they don't want to be associated with it. So they're backpedaling as fast as they possibly can, falling over each other on their way back, because they know that this is very unpopular with the American public. I read a statistic over the weekend that says potentially as many as 40% of pregnancies are because of IVF. Women are delaying pregnancy into much later in their lives, into their 30s and even into their 40s. And as a result, they're having to rely more often on IVF to conceive and to carry a pregnancy. And if 40% of pregnancies in this country are the result of IVF, you can see how popular IVF is as a method for conception. And so the Republicans realized that this was so extreme that they had to distance themselves as fast as they could. Now, mind you, some of them are having to reverse their previous positions. I mean, Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House, obviously, has said before he considers all abortion to be murder. And so, he clearly is to even pretend that he is for IVF is hypocritical at best, and clearly meant for political expediency. Don't trust him. The minute that they would take power of the presidency and the Senate and the House, we might face very similar kinds of legislation to allow this kind of extremism.
I mean, there's something called the Life at Conception Act in Congress now, which I think has 120 sponsors, almost all, or probably all, Republican sponsors. But again, it goes to this notion that a single cell zygote is not only a person, but in many cases of some of these laws has rights that trump the personal rights or individual rights of the mother,
That's right.
which is an extraordinary kind of scientific thing.
Well, it's not based on science, obviously. As you said, it's extraordinary, but it also means that women's lives are endangered as a result of it. If a woman's life is on par with a fertilized egg, what happens when the fertilized egg is now threatening her life, like in an ectopic pregnancy, or develops into a fetus that continuing the pregnancy endangers her life and future fertility? So whose rights now are preeminent? And essentially this anti-abortion forces dominated by Republicans and a very conservative Supreme Court are saying that her life doesn't take precedence necessarily. I mean, we're going to debate now in this Supreme Court session. They're going to hear a case out of Idaho and a very similar case out of Texas, that an emergency abortion to stabilize a woman who's in critical condition does not have to be performed by emergency rooms if the state has decided to ban abortion. And in many different situations where you have a woman who is hemorrhaging in the middle of a miscarriage, that they can deny her an abortion that would stabilize her situation. And that is the medical standard of care in a situation like that. That is going to be debated in front of this Supreme Court. And when they decided to take the case, they said to Idaho, you can keep your ban in place, under which the Idaho authorities are saying you can't perform an emergency abortion in an emergency room. You can keep that ban in place until we make a decision in this case. I mean, think about that. This Supreme Court has said that a medical standard of care in an emergency situation, that a state doesn't have to comply. I mean, that in effect, that's what this decision in Alabama is saying. It's shocking. And I think people have to understand, and believe me, women are paying attention, and they do understand what these kinds of decisions mean for women.
How, I'd seen some polling a couple weeks ago that maybe, Dobbs, which has been a huge factor in the last cycles in 2022, and a lot of these special elections across the country. How salient do you think this will be in 2024? And, what's the significance from a political perspective?
All of the pundits who keep saying that this is now no longer the compelling issue that it was in 2022, which immediately the first election to follow the Dobbs decision, or even in some of these special elections, are fooling themselves. This is a top issue for women, especially young women. And it doesn't even matter where they live. They can live in New York or California, where abortion rights are enshrined in the Constitution. They're taking nothing for granted because, of course, if anti-abortion adherents were in charge of the presidency and the Congress, they could do anything they wanted to. And they have the sympathies of an extreme majority on the U.S. Supreme Court. So you can take nothing for granted. And women fundamentally understand, whether they're even in childbearing age, they understand what this position really means. I mean, maybe they have daughters, maybe they have younger sisters or grandchildren who are impacted by these laws. It means that if you are pregnant and you are taking a vacation to Texas and you become critical because of a miscarriage, you are now putting your life at stake on a vacation that if you stayed in California, you would be taken care of. I mean, so you can't even travel to these states that have these bans. Women understand this to their core, what this means. it also means that those who are espousing these views think so little of women's lives that they would enact these kinds of laws. And so they're taking no chances. It will be a top issue until we have restored abortion rights permanently across this country. And we intend to do that.
Where do things stand in terms of contraception and bans and that whole issue, which is again, I think opponents of abortion rights, were saying, oh, that's, this is really a limited thing. It doesn't really go into that, but it does it not?
Well, the Alabama decision certainly does. And if that becomes the law of the land in some of these other states, you're going to see the cutoff of some forms of contraception and birth control in those states. It's just a matter of time. And frankly, the anti-abortion movement's going after it nationwide. They have now working to get a rejuvenation of the Comstock law. That law prohibited the mailing of birth control anywhere in the country, or even information. They want to use it to apply to the abortion pill. So that you can't mail the abortion pill. You must only distribute it in in-person meetings with the doctor and or our nurse practitioner and the patient. So they intend to re-energize the Comstock laws, and don't think they can't get away with it. I mean, again, this is a Supreme Court that's been very clear. We have at least 4 very extreme positions in that court. And should there be any more who are added to it, we could see contraception go by the wayside too. So everyone has to understand where this ultimately leads. This is a slippery slope that does lead to banning even contraception.
Yeah. When you take a step back and look at all of these in aggregate, I mean, what's behind it? You mentioned Christian nationalism a little earlier. I mean, seriously, is this like a push for a theocracy in the United States? You talked about Mike Johnson, the second in the line to the presidency. What's your take on all that?
I think there is a very strong Christian nationalist movement that overlaps with the movement that we see spearheaded by Donald Trump towards a more authoritarian state, a more authoritarian government. And under authoritarianism, controlling women's reproduction is very key. We've seen it all over the world where authoritarianism is on the rise. Women's rights are among the first to be attacked, and certainly abortion rights, because that is freedom for women. It's bodily autonomy, it's freedom from being forced into pregnancy repeatedly. So it's a fundamental shift in women's rights, which threatens the authoritarians. So I think there's a real effort in this country to take control of women's reproduction again as part of an overall political strategy and a rise of the right wing, no question.
Yeah. What is your message going to be to the women's political committee? Are you going to talk about the need for more women in politics, or these kinds of issues, or what's the thrust of your talk?
Definitely the need for more women in politics. I think the work that the Women's Committee in Santa Barbara has been doing is extraordinary. They have been a very big boost for women running in the greater Santa Barbara area, but even nationally, because they support women running for Congress and for the Senate. So that's a very important part of the work. Another critical piece that I want them to understand, and many of them already do, is how close we are to getting the Equal Rights Amendment into the US Constitution and how critical that is, including for abortion. And I'll explain that. First is how close we are. There's an effort in the Congress to pass a joint resolution in both the Senate and the House, declaring that the ERA, recognizing that it has been ratified. The Equal Rights Amendment has been ratified, full stop. It came out of Congress in 1972 with the supermajority vote of both houses, which the Constitution requires. And it has been ratified by 38 state legislatures, or 3/4 of the states, which is the only other requirement the Constitution places on adding an amendment. So it has been ratified. It has not yet been recognized and put into the Constitution. And the resolutions that are pending in the House and the Senate would say that, notwithstanding this time limit that was in the proposing legislation, the preamble, that the ERA has been ratified as the 28th Amendment and must be published as such. So that's a big push. And we have a majority support in the Senate. It only takes a majority vote. And we are very close in the House because Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, is opposed and refuses to bring that resolution to the floor. The proponents have launched what's called a discharge petition. And that means that if you get enough signatures, I believe it's 217 on the discharge petition, it has to come to the floor. And by the way, the interesting point of fact is that it was how it got to the floor in 1972 was through a discharge petition, because the leadership at that time opposed bringing it to the floor. But when it got to the floor, it got over 2/3 support in the House. And we think the same thing could happen again in this House if it can get to the floor. So there's only about 3 or 4 Republicans short of getting them to support a discharge petition. So we're getting very close. The point I want to make is that if we don't get it in this time, that's why the elections are so important in both the Senate and the House, is to make sure that we get those majorities in there that can vote these resolutions through. It's important for abortion for this reason. We just got a magnificent decision out of Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court in Pennsylvania just said that the state Equal Rights Amendment in Pennsylvania, which mimics the federal ERA language almost exactly, that to restrict Medicaid funding for abortion in Pennsylvania is sex discriminatory. To restrict abortion is sex discriminatory. We know that, but we don't have a constitutional right to be free from sex discrimination, and that's what the Equal Rights Amendment will do. So if we can get the Equal Rights Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, we can start to get rid of these bans and these terrible restrictions across the country on abortion. It's the only way to fully restore abortion rights in this country.
Yeah. So, another reason that the stakes are so high on this election, as you mentioned, the congressional and the House and Senate races, and of course there's 5 or 6 crucial House elections here in California. Is your organization taking an active role in those? And talk about the significance of that to the national picture, if you would.
Yes, we are. Our political arm, the Feminist Majority, and we're pretty much waiting to see what happens in the primaries, to see who emerges in the top 2 candidates in some of these key districts. But we have to be sure that Katie Porter's district stays Democratic. There's other potential flips here in California because how close the 2022 elections were in these districts, and the fact that Biden won some of these districts that ended up electing a Republican in 2022 for the House seat. So we're monitoring everything very closely, as well as in other parts of the country, because we only need a few seats to take the majority in the House. We'd like to get as many seats as possible so that we have a solid basis support for women's rights and abortion rights in the House, and we need to hold on to the Senate, which is also going to be a very tough fight. So every seat matters and every vote matters in this election. And the key will be if the voting public understands where these different candidates stand on this most fundamental issue of abortion and women's rights. In addition to the other issues, obviously, that are in play in this election, but those are top issues for women voters, and especially, as I said, for young women voters. And so it's going to be very key in mobilizing the vote, as well as the outcome of these elections.
So where are you on the panic scale when you look at these national presidential polls that show Donald Trump as leading Joe Biden in the popular vote, and he's leading in a number of these battleground states? How do you account for that? I mean, here's a guy that, led a coup. He's got 91 felony counts against him. A million people died during COVID while he wanted to inject bleach. I mean, what's your analysis of how this can be?
I worry about it all the time, and it drives me, and it drives the work that we do. I think some of those polls have been very dishonest, to be frank about it. It makes a difference if you are polling likely voters versus registered voters versus everybody. It makes a big difference. And among registered voters, Biden generally is in the lead, even in the battleground states. I think that a lot is going to play out, for example, in both Nevada and Arizona. Those are two states that are going to have abortion constitutional measures on their ballots that will mobilize very large votes for abortion rights. And it depends on how clear all the campaigns are and where they stand on these issues, these fundamental issues of women's equality and abortion rights. But the pundits have been saying since 2022 that that Republicans were going to sweep the midterms, and that didn't happen. And then all of these special elections, and every time women's votes and those who support reproductive rights have succeeded in these elections, and that can happen again. It must happen again. And so everybody's going to be sounding the alarm. And one other thing, I think all too often, some of these polling operations, first of all, they're polling nationwide. They're polling 1,000 people nationwide. This election is only going to be decided in 5 or 6 states. Let's face it. California is going to go blue. So don't include them in your polls. And 2 years ago, in 2022, Ms. and the Feminist Majority Foundation commissioned polling by Celinda Lake and Lake Research Partners, a very prominent, respected pollster, in the battleground states. And we came out with abortion rights and women's rights was the #1 issue for young women. #1. The next important issue to them was 20 points down from that. And for all women, it was tied with inflation or the economy as being a top issue. That was absolutely different from all of the other pundits polls that were using national polls and not drilling down to what women were thinking. And we were right when we said there wasn't going to be a red wave. And it was women's votes that stopped the flood and made it a trickle. So we're gonna be looking very closely at all these polls. And the last thing I will say about too many of the pollsters and the pundits, it's funded by media organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth. They're looking for competitive races. I mean, they want to make it a competition because without that, all that money isn't going to pour in for advertising. And too much of the media is dependent on this political year advertising. It's going to be billions of dollars. So they got to keep it as a horse race as long as possible. But we take nothing for granted.
All right. And then just real quick, I mean, I guess another question I would have about the elections is, Trump has, or there's been reporting at least that Donald Trump favors a 16-week abortion ban. I mean, what is your assessment of the likelihood or the possibility of a national abortion ban, a federal abortion ban?
Well, if he's elected president and the Congress goes Republican, I think it's a very real possibility. And, people say, well, most abortions are done before 16 weeks. So what's the big deal? A ban is a ban. And for women who are getting the kind of genetic testing later in pregnancy to identify fetuses with, for example, encephalitis, encephaly, which is no brain, is developing. And it's a fatal condition for the fetus. If the fetus makes it through 9 months, it will die upon birth. Those tests are mostly in the 18 to 20 week category. So you're asking with a 16-week ban that some women are going to not find out about a fatal diagnosis for the fetus until after that ban takes effect. So any ban is bad. It should always be the decision of the woman, and for medical conditions in consultation with her doctor. So he's trying to soften it. He's thinking that's a middle ground. It's not a total ban. It's they're fooling themselves, and we're going to make sure that those kind of lies do not stand in the course of this election. A ban at 16 weeks is a dangerous ban for those women who need a later abortion because of a crisis.
All right. All right. Well, listen, for tickets to the President's Circle Luncheon of the Women's Political Committee next Friday, March 8th, at the Cabrillo Pavilion, go to sbwpc.org/events. And there are scholarships for students. I know, Kathy, you've talked about the importance of young women voters. And you can hear Kathy's speech about all of this and get to talk to colleagues and try to do some organizing. All right, Kathy Spillar, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time on Newsmakers.
Thank you.